This is International Master Eric Kislik covering another one of the candidates' games. And this is a game from round one played between Caruana and Wesley So. In the interests of full disclosure, I thought So had very good chances to win the tournament before the tournament started, but with being paired black 2 games in a row and losing both games, it's going to be very, very difficult to come back. But Caruana played a very good game. I think his opening choice was very interesting. Caruana mixes it up a fair amount between playing e4 and d4, and in this game he went for d4, and Wesley So decided to play a standard Catalan. He played bishop b4 check. Some players will play knight d2 here just to kind of give the play a slightly different character. Bishop d2, bishop e7. This is actually the main line nowadays in the Catalans. So d5 was played, knight f3, castle, castle, c6. That's the main move nowadays. Very, very solid. In general, the main thing to understand here is that black's main plan of development is to play knight bd7, b6, and usually bishop b7 or bishop a6. So he has a pretty simple plan of development. So white went queen to b3, and another plan for black is just to simply go b6 and then bishop to a6. And this kind of keeps an eye on the pawn on e2, and I'll just show one simple variation where you can see that the e2 pawn is attacked. For example, knight c6, knight takes d5, queen takes d5, take, 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 and then bishop takes e2, captures the e2 pawn, and the position is equal. So in the case of b6, that's definitely one way to counter queen b3. You might be a little confused why he played queen b3. I think he just wanted to get So out of book, play a slightly rarer line, basically just see how he was going to develop his pieces. But I think b6 is probably the simplest way to equalize with black. So knight bd7 was played, white went bishop f4. In general, in this pawn structure, white's main plan is to play for e4. So he's planning to play knight bd2 and maybe try to prepare e4. So a5 was played, which is interesting because it prepares to play b5, and then if white takes the pawn on b5, black can capture back, and if white takes with the queen, there's bishop a6, and the e2 pawn is loose. So white continued with rook d1, and black could have played b5 now, like he did in the game a few moves later. He threw in knight h5. The bishop went back to c1. He could have gone b5 now. I think this would have been good. Take, take, knight e5. He could just go queen c7, and of course if queen takes b5, there's bishop a6. So he probably wanted to avoid that. But yeah, so he just decided to repeat moves, which was totally fine as well. Knight bd2 was a novelty, actually. There was an Ulibin game where Grandmaster Ulibin played knight c3. But anyway, black went for b5. And really, white's only way to play for an advantage is to go c5. And now the big question here is black going to get his e5 pawn break in? Because really, it's a battle of pawn breaks in the center. Black wants to play for e5, and white wants to play for e4. So it's basically a race. And I thought the simplest move was just the natural queen c7, preparing for e5. And if white goes queen c3, then we go b4, and the position's equal. So here queen c7 seemed much easier to me. b4 was interesting, but I don't think it was ultimately enough. Queen c2, a4. Here rook e1 was probably excessively subtle. I think a lot simpler for white would have just been to go e4 right away. And now let's say if takes b3, which is an interesting tactical shot. You could just go queen c3 and then knight to d2. And here I think white is objectively better. Black's pieces are a bit passive, in particular the bishop on c8. But the bishop on e7 is also not doing very much. So anyway, he went rook e1, and now black needed his pawn break. This is one of those cases where you absolutely have to break out. And here black went for e5, which was a temporary pawn sacrifice. So after knight takes e5, knight takes e5, d takes e5, he just went knight d7. And now with c5 and e5 both attacked, he's going to win one of them back. So this was really interesting. Knight f3, defending the e5 pawn. Bishop takes c5, knight g5, g6, bishop f4. An important point here is that e6 could not be played right now. Take with the fork because of queen f6 with the threat against f2. So this would be losing. So he played bishop f4, good preparatory move. And he has ideas like e4, ideas like e6. So queen b6 was played, putting pressure against f2. So white played e4, completely natural move. And now b3 was played. Take, and the queen just moved to safety to e2, still maintaining control over f2. And this is where the main mistake was made. And actually, in the commentary after the game, Wesley So admitted, and he actually put it in very, very simple terms. He just said, after bishop a6, I had no more defensive pieces. I had no pieces near my king. And interestingly enough, I mean, that does actually really explain the big problem that he had. His bishop really just was not very effective when it was sitting on c4 in the game. So it would have been a better move, would have been the very nice move rook a2, which is what I call a sliding move. It's sliding along the same line of contact as the rook, but stopping just before exchanging to improve the rook and provoke white to exchange on a2. So here, one interesting line is if e6, we could play take, and then if check, play king g7. And there's no actual way to directly continue the attack. And if he plays something like e takes d5, we have bishop a6, and rook takes b2, and here we have good pressure against the f2 pawn, ensuring that black has very good counterplay. So fortunately, after rook a2, I think black is completely equal, or at least has sufficient dynamic chances. So bishop a6 is what Wesley So said after the game is really what did him in. So after queen f3, white threatens to take on d5 and then go e6. So the threats are pretty serious here. He went takes, and then e6. This was a great shot. And the idea is that if the pawn is captured, he can just go bishop b8, which is a really nice move, threatening queen f7 check and queen takes h7 mate. So after f takes e6, he could also just play bishop c7. So he had to play d takes e4, and white took on f7. Bishop takes f7, knight takes e4. Here it was mentioned in the press conference that rook e8 would have been a better move. I agree, although white can play rook c1, bishop d5, queen to d3, and black is still definitely in some trouble here. For example, if bishop d4, we can play knight to d6 and queen to e2. And it seems like black's king's in pretty big trouble here. Bishop takes d5, check is the threat. So white is still objectively winning there. But after bishop d4, knight to d6, I think he had no chance to really defend this. If he played knight f6, we can take and play bishop f1 and then bishop c4 check, like bishop c4. Take, queen e4. I still think this would have been the best defense to play this position, but ultimately white is winning here. The bishop is very strong. White will probably have g4, g5 at the right moment. So anyway, bishop d5 was played, and the queen simply dropped back to e2. He may have been expecting queen to g4 here, although that seems unlikely because it allows bishop takes f2 check. But it's hard to say. So the queen had been on e2 a few moves ago, and it moved back. But this all looks like it wasn't all that difficult to calculate. So knight to f8 was played to try to cover the e6 square. White simply takes and then comes right back to f3 again. Now there's pressure against the d5 pawn, and if black goes rook a7, we can just take and go rook e8, and that's a helpless position. He simply played queen to a5, and white played rook e7. And here my engine announces mate in 14 with bishop e3 followed by queen f7 check as the main threat. There doesn't appear to be any decent way to defend. Also, we can play bishop h6, so both bishop e3 and bishop h6 look very powerful, and black's not able to defend. So ultimately, what caused Wesley So's loss here was simply that he had no pieces defending his king, and he really wasn't able to get any activity. Had he played that rook a2 move, he would have had pressure against the b2 pawn and probably would have saved the game. So very good play by Fabiano Caruana, and should be very interesting to follow how the rest of the tournament goes.